It's safe to say that World of Warcraft has had its fair share of ups and downs throughout its lifetime. It's 2025, and the game is celebrating its 21st anniversary. As someone who's played somewhat casually, and most certainly off and on for many years now, I can say from experience that WoW has a pattern of hitting roadblocks. Every couple of expansions, the game starts to feel stagnant. Features that would usually be fun or exciting start to seem like your next big chore, the story seems to be going in a completely irrelevant direction, and there's nothing about the new state of the game that really sparks interest anymore. For this project, I'll be looking at Legion and how its utilization of story, mechanics, and player experience makes it the best modern expansion and ultimately led to it being the savior of early modern WoW. There's always going to be a debate on what the best expansion is, and that's because the best is subjective. It's all opinion. But what I really want to do today is talk about the core aspects of Legion as an expansion, and why those aspects allowed it to pivot the game's direction for the better. Because let's be real, after Warlords of Draenor, it didn't seem like WoW was heading anywhere particularly great. Oftentimes, it feels like Blizzard is desperately throwing ideas at a wall and hoping one of them sticks. Nearing the end of the Classic era, Blizzard had some big changes to implement to the world, and to do that, they brought us Cataclysm. What better way to introduce major aesthetic changes to zones and the game in general than to have a giant raging dragon destroy the places we learned to love? There were definitely some positive changes made to the game, but unfortunately for Blizzard, Cataclysm stands out as a cataclysmic flop for a lot of players. And it's not just the fact that the world itself got destroyed. Many game features got majorly rehauled. Classes, talent trees, even character models were updated. Many of the changes were a huge step from the previous state of the game, and they all came at once. Because of this, the expansion is regarded as a disappointment for many, and it marks a low point in the history of WoW. After Cataclysm, we went on to receive Mists of Pandaria, which brought some beautiful zones, but the story felt random and more standalone than connected to the rest of the lore. And after Mists, we got Warlords of Draenor, which some would argue was an even bigger flop than Cataclysm. The story took place in the past, but also in an alternate timeline. I played a lot during this expansion. The zones and mob designs were neat, but the rest of the expansion left a bit to be desired. The garrison feature that got added was something that wanted to be great, but ended up falling short. If we shift our focus to Legion, we can take a better look at how it succeeded where other modern expansions failed. Legion's story took significant aspects of lore told earlier in the game's history and built upon them rather than destroying them or going in a direction completely unrelated. The expansion introduced changes to existing game systems that felt fresh rather than gimmicky. Finally, and most importantly, Legion gave players freedom of choice in their gameplay experience and a strong sense of identity and community among one another. Unfortunately, we can't compare Legion's subscriber count to the prior expansions because Blizzard stopped releasing official reports as of November 2015, but we can take a look at the trends leading up to its release. In October of 2012, Blizzard stated in its financial report that 2.7 million copies of Mists of Pandaria were sold on release, and the game's global player base passed 10 million subscribers. Numbers reported in 2014's second quarter had significantly dropped, with the game then having 6.8 million subscribers. Despite beating Mists in copies sold on release, Warlords took a much stronger nosedive in subscriber count than its predecessor. It also shared a peak of over 10 million subscribers on release, but at the end of 2015's third quarter, subscriber count was 5.5 million, which at the time marked a record low. For comparison, that's an approximate 4 million sub drop in 2 years versus a 5 million drop in 1. These numbers prove a clear point. The problem with telling your audience, hey guys, this is the story for the upcoming expansion, and it's really cool, but it doesn't really relate to anything you guys know thus far. Here's this new zone and these new characters, be hype, is that there's nothing really investing them and getting them excited for it, and nothing to really keep them interested if the story itself falls short. That's where Legion's shone. Not only is the big bad Burning Legion making a big bad return, but Illidan is too, and we're learning more about his backstory? The Legion and Illidan's respective stories are way too expansive to get into in a 10-minute video, but the thing is, Blizzard took something people loved from the lore and they gave us more of it. Characters that we already knew, such as Khadgar, Illidan, and Velen, were at the forefront of the story, and we got to see them grow throughout the expansion. It is evident that Blizzard realized how much of a disappointment Warlords of Draenor was to a lot of their fanbase. Warlords received 2 content patches for the entirety of its existence. This drove many people to lose the passion and interest they once had. Leif Johnson touches on this in a review and says he was convinced that nothing killed the love for it so much as the way Blizzard seemed to ignore it for months. It's clear they did their best to win people back with Legion because it, on the other hand, received 3 content updates, and they were big. In an interview with Polygon regarding patch 7.2, senior designer Ryan Schwader said, "It's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, patches in the history of WoW." Where WoW has really lost its fanbase in the past is times of content drought. We saw it in Cataclysm, and we saw it again in Warlords of Draenor. Thankfully, they seemed to get their act together when it came to Legion. On launch, Legion brought many changes to existing game systems and some entirely new ones. As soon as you get to the Broken Isles, you're given the quest of hunting down your class-specific artifact weapon. Artifact weapons were super cool. Instead of needing to replace your weapon every couple of levels to maintain an increase in your character's strength, you instead got one weapon at the beginning of the expansion, and you grew with it throughout the entire campaign and into the endgame. In an IGN review by Leif Johnson, he says regarding artifact weapons, "The idea is appealing enough, as most of them feature such iconic weapons from Warcraft lore as the famed Ashbringer sword for Retribution Paladins or Thrall's former Doomhammer for Enhancement Shamans." A couple new systems introduced with Legion that went over well and are still utilized to this day are World Quests and Mythic Plus dungeons. I say new, but it can be argued that both were just major changes to existing systems. World Quests essentially replaced the heavy lean on daily quests when it came to endgame content. You still have a selection of them to choose from daily, but instead of having to do the same repetitive thing back to back, World Quests have timers and rotate out once they expire. There is still a finite selection, it's just overall less repetitive feeling than dailies. Mythic Plus dungeons were a deviation from the then existing challenge modes. Similar to challenge mode in the sense of having a time limit, but different in the sense that Mythic Plus offers an endless dungeon mode that scales in difficulty and rewards every time it is completed. There is a variety of affixes, modifiers that apply to enemies in the dungeon, and they each encourage different planning or playstyles to successfully beat. Again, something that's too much to explain the intricacies of in a 10-minute video, but to sum it up, Mythic Plus offered a fresh new endgame challenge to players. In a January 2019 interview with Forbes, Blizzard employee Morgan Day says, looking back on the introduction of Mythic Plus, "We added Mythic Plus dungeons in Legion almost as like an experiment. We weren't really sure of how it was going to be received by the community." Fast forward to today, and Mythic Plus holds a significant place in WoW's competitive scene with an official Blizzard tournament as well as global leaderboards, which encourages competition within the community. There were also some changes made to PvP, and as Stephen Messner mentions in an article published on PC Gamer, some of the changes are contentious, but they do make endgame PvP far more approachable for people who don't have the time to dedicate to both PvE and PvP. Before Legion, players earned PvP-specific currency and were able to spend it on PvP-specific gear. That system was retired upon Legion's release, and instead Blizzard opted for an automatic scaling of all gear, PvP or PvE, to a level playing field when players entered a PvP instance. How many times can I say PvP? The last addition I want to briefly mention is the Demon Hunter class. Many players argue that expansions regarded as the best throughout WoW's history usually brought a new class with them. Considering Wrath and Legion are my top two, and they brought Death Knights and Demon Hunters respectively, I would have to agree. Demon Hunter is overall a very fun class to play. It's flashy, it's fast, and it's powerful. Not only is the class a great addition to the game and still enjoyable today, but it brought with it an amazing starting zone that added more depth to the Legion story. My last point is a big one, and in my opinion, one of the most important aspects of a successful expansion, and it's the player experience. Regardless of cool new features or an amazing and detailed story, if the expansion doesn't offer an enjoyable experience to its players, it's just bound to fail. Leif Johnson mentions in his Legion review on IGN, previous expansions treated you pretty much the same regardless of whether you wielded a magic staff or a poison-tipped dagger, but Legion does much to give each class its own sense of identity. That was the fun thing about Legion. With the introduction of artifact weapons as well as class halls, class pride felt stronger than it ever had before. Class halls not only added a new layer of fantasy immersion to the game, but they were essentially an upgraded and less isolating version of garrisons from the previous expansion. Class halls were a big part of the Legion campaign, as were garrisons to the Warlords campaign. But instead of isolating players to their own private instance, everyone of the same class on a server shared the instance. Something Legion did differently with its campaign was the inclusion of quests that required dungeon completion. Leif Johnson notes, "Warlords showed us what a heavily single-player focused expansion was like, and it wasn't pretty." The game really was starting to feel less massively multiplayer and more solo player with the option to make friends. Many seasoned WoW players argue that their biggest disappointment with the game in its modern era is the lack of the true MMORPG feel. In Classic, you used to have to interact with other people, players had to band together to complete otherwise insanely difficult quests or encounters, and there was a true sense of camaraderie in WoW that now feels more distant by the day. One of the main components of the Legion story was acquiring the Pillars of Creation. To do so, you had to get a group together or use the group finder and complete various dungeons as well as the Nighthold raid, with each item being at the end of one. Some might argue this was an annoying choice on Blizzard's behalf, but I disagree. The game isn't a solo campaign with an online feature, it's an MMO and it should feel like one. Finally, the Legion campaign gave players freedom to choose the order that they wanted to play through zones. This was a shift from content beforehand, which restricted players to a very linear progression of the story, as each new zone had a level restriction. If you were at the same level, or just about, as the enemies in a given zone, good luck attempting to do anything there. In Legion, zones instead scaled to a character's level, meaning players got to choose the order of how they worked through the story. This was a really great choice for Blizzard to make, and with the amount of content available to choose from today, it would be silly to restrict players to one set order of experiencing it. In conclusion, story, mechanics, and player experience are just some of the aspects that made Legion such a success. At the end of the day, there will always be a discussion around the best expansion of all time, but what can't be argued is that there's a clear formula for creating a good one. Here's to hoping that Blizzard takes notes on the successes of Legion and continues to apply them to future releases, because if there's one thing I don't want to play through, it's another blunder of an expansion.